Hello, people of the internet, and welcome to this neon-colored extravaganza that will guide you through the worst corners of the Bach library. My name is Daniele Ghisi, and I will be presenting this, let's say, work, which I did with my colleague and friend, Andrea Agostini. Forgive the tone and the graphics of the presentation. The lockdown has been hard on us, and intense photoshopping with bright colors seems as good an activity as any. Bach is a library for computer-aided composition in Max. Andrea and I started developing it around 2010, and the underlying principle was that a real-time paradigm could be a game-changer to handle scores as interactively as one could handle audio buffers. We think we had luck to take a couple of right decisions at the very beginning, but in retrospect, we made some really poor choices, and we would like to come clean today on the mistakes we think we have made, and on how we have tried to solve them, in the hope that someone else may benefit from our occasional shipwreck, and in the hope that brighter minds than ours may come up with elegant solutions we hadn't thought of. Consider this as a sort of step 1 of AA. In the grand tradition of BuzzFeed posts, we'll present to you the 10 worst mistakes, 10 ways in which things have gone wrong. Of course, actual mistakes are much more than 10. I'm sure that both I and Andrea have our own personal shame lists, but this list is our intersection, the 10 worst mistakes we both agree upon. The conference article contains more ideas about, perhaps not ideas, let's say details. Perhaps not even details, let's say sentences. The article contains more sentences than this talk. And also, it strikes a marginally more serious note. But there is a point, I think, in self-deprecating humor. We know that Bach's user base is growing large, and it seems important today, as Bach turns 10, and as we go open source with it, to put a spotlight on its shortcomings and not just on its strong points. Let's start with mistake number 10. 2 editors are one too many. When we started Bach, we were both intensive users of open music, and it made sense at the time to quote-unquote borrow some of its paradigms. One of them was the opposition between metric and proportional notation. That is why in Bach we have 2 score editors, the first one dedicated to proportional notation, bach.roll, and the second one dedicated to traditional metric notation, bach.score. In retrospect, it would have been better to think of a single editor, combining the 2 behaviors. It may have led to more interesting scenarios. And if you think that I'm using the combined editor right now, well, unfortunately, it's just a picture with a run and score superposed, so sorry about that. We have done a couple of things to ease the pain. The most important one is probably the possibility to warp the time grid of bach.roll in a very general way, including the ability of matching it to the spacing of a bach.score. Vice versa, we have added a proportional notation display for bach.score, with a few small tricks to make it easier to read, but having a single object would have been more powerful. Mistake number 9, 6 inlets are 5 too many. Another thing we have quote-unquote borrowed from open music is the idea of having separate inlets and outlets for each of the main musical parameters. And yet, the more I use computer-aided composition, the more this paradigm where one builds each parameter separately and then they are somehow magically combined to form a score, well, to me it feels like an old gizmo from the 40s or something. I tend to avoid it whenever I can, and when I see patches like these, I have an urge to scratch myself and blow the dust off. Scripting feels much more intuitive and practical in a way, and Bach somehow has evolved to account for it much more than for separate parameter handling. In any case, all the information about the score is output from the first outlet, so we could have devised a couple of helper tools to set and get separate parameters from there. Mistake number 8. Queries are slow. Max lists are fast, but they only can contain up to a few thousand elements. The issue is how to deal with 10, 100, 1,000 times more elements, which is not that uncommon. Bach implements its own data structure called list-like linked list, or LLL for short, which is used to communicate across all the library. LLLs are lists that support nesting and have no hard limit in size or in depth. But this doesn't mean that searching through them is going to be fast. As a matter of fact, it is bound to be ON which means linear in the number of elements, and hence relatively slow for large lists. To account for this problem, we have created in the data library a set of objects to deal with SQL databases. Granted, filling a database will still require more time, but once you've done it, your queries will be sublinear. Mistake number 7, not enough numbers, and more specifically, not enough integer numbers. And this is not a Bach issue per se. It is very easy to have max overflow. Look at this product of primes yielding a negative number. But this is not a good thing if your representation system relies on rational numbers like rational duration in music. And think about this, whenever you put two durations together, there's actually a computation involving the least common multiple of their denominators somewhere in the code. Look at how clumsy it gets when we add durations whose denominators are successive primes. And look at how Bach completely messes things up at the overflow point. It doesn't have to be like this. One of the things we miss the most from Lisp is its arbitrary precision arithmetics. The same algorithm in open music yields an ugly to see but yet very consistent result. You can just keep working with exotic fractions and then rely on some future quantization. This is not possible in Bach. If you need to work this way, Bach roll is the only way to go. I think that at some point in the future we may want to integrate an arbitrary precision arithmetic library that comes into play for large numbers only. I would love to see something like this in Max at some point. This is a test for primality of a Mersenne number, and by the way, no, that's not a working implementation, that's just an image, sorry about that. Mistake number 6. Bad pitches. We have got accustomed to the idea that in computer-aided composition a pitch is represented by its value in MIDI cents, or in MIDI numbers. And don't get me wrong, I love cents and MIDI numbers as much as the next guy, but a pitch is a more complex entity. Just have a look at this chord and tell me if it doesn't make you wanna cry. In older versions of Bach, we handled enharmonicity in such a cumbersome way that I'm ashamed of even talking about it. But now we are relatively proud of our solution, which is a new data type called pitch, which one can express in a variety of ways. For most purposes, pitches behave like sort of numbers. You can make some arithmetics with them. Importantly, a pitch is also an interval, and an interval is also a pitch. Exactly like 100 cents represents both a very low C sharp and a semitone, D sharp 0 represents both a very low D sharp and an interval of augmented second. This is crucial to make arithmetics with these guys. Here's an example of how things get transposed, by augmented seconds or by minor thirds. And here's how you may want to generate a circle of fifths via an arithmetic series. And yes, middle C is C5, that's not up for debate. Mistake number 5. Escaping is hell. Look at these symbols. It contains parentheses which Bach interprets as a sublist, which is fair enough. But then we need a way to tell Bach that this was supposed to be just a symbol. We have decided to go with backticks as escaping sign, so you put a backtick before anything and it's going to be interpreted literally as a symbol, not parsed into any other thing. We were relatively proud of the backtick because it was ASCII and it wasn't that much used. The way we implemented it, it only escapes the portion before the first space, which means that you don't need an ending sign for escaping, so we thought it was cool. In our defense, we would have gone with the double quotes, but in Max there's no way to use them consistently for symbols that do not contain a space within them. The real issue with backticking came when we put bach.eval into play. Bach.eval implements a scripting language for Bach. And at some point, we really wanted to use symbols as keys to retrieve values and set values. And at that point, things became very, very difficult to handle. The only way we could do that with the escaping we had was to put a lot of spaces pretty much everywhere. It was a mess. The way we solved it, at least within bach.eval, is by using single quotes in a Python style, let's say. But this only works for bach eval. I find it very clean, but unfortunately it's only for bach eval, because otherwise it would have broken the compatibility of older patches, so we didn't feel at ease with that. And yet some nights when it is cold outside and I crawl into my warm bed with a chocolate chip cookie and a cup of herbal tea, I dream of this. Mistake number 4. Bad names. Classic mistake, always in fashion. I think our worst naming was probably bach.append. Many bach modules mirror for bach lists what ZL modules do for standard max lists. But the issue is that bach.append did what ZL join did, which is quirky. And then at some point, you want a module that does for bach lists what append does for max lists. And you run into trouble, you cannot use append any longer. It takes 1 minute to choose a bad name, it takes 10 years to try to let it go, and there's still not enough. We deprecated bach.append at some point, we added bach.join, but we had to use the awfully named bach.postpend as a proxy for the append module. Mistake number 3. Very much related. Bad defaults. No one in the history of computer music has ever needed to iterate a list for more than one level at a time. I may be exaggerating a little bit to make a point, but bach.iter and bach.mapelement both operate by default at all levels of depth, which is essentially what you never need. And this obliges you always to write a max depth attribute explicitly. I think that for this one we have a plan. We will introduce 2 more modules, bach.for and bach.map, that we do the same things at one level only. But the jungle of defaults is full of ramifications. There's certainly no lack of bad default choices in Bach. We chose the direction of rotation for the lists wrong. We chose different depth default for different modules, which makes sense, I think, individually, but it doesn't make sense in general. And we get to mistake number 2, too complex abstractions. I think that a patch is worth 1,000 words. Meet bach.counter. Meet cage.fm. The thing is, we all love max visual programming, but it easily leads to spaghetti coding, even for relatively simple patches. And this makes those patches hard to read and hard to maintain. Our tentative solution is to introduce a scripting language called Bell. And yes, it is another scripting language, but it makes sense, I think, because it's really tailored on Bach lists. Although I suppose that every new scripting language could make this argument to some extent. But honestly, from my own experience, I've been really using it more and more because it helps streamlining complex patches and it reduces the complexity in one point. And it makes it also more maintainable. Sometimes you really can do in a couple of lines of code what you may need a complex patch to accomplish. We have already started to modify some of our own abstractions to account for it. And speaking of coding, let's get to mistake number 1. Drum roll, please. Bad coding. Now that Bach is open source, you can go and have a look for yourself. The code is awful. Okay, mostly awful. There are perhaps portions of it of which we are relatively proud, but they are drowning in a froth of dusty layers. The thing is, we learn how to code properly. Well, we try to learn how to code properly while writing Bach. And the older the code is, the higher the chances that it contains weird naming conventions, unnecessarily long loops, and so on. Plus, we started using the CMax API, and we honestly wished we had used more C++ at the beginning, because it would have made life easier for many purposes. And yet, in spite of everything I've said, we love Bach no matter what, and if everything goes well, we shall spend the next 10 years trying again,
failing again,
and we promise our cahier de doléances will be much longer in 2030.
Peace and love.